So you can see where we're heading. First of all, there's tremendously important work done as a background. Now you can see that we're at a place where you should think about how to move this forward. So let me say a word first of all. I mean, for Deborah's stuff, it's really important because we say that actually there's not a single sector in many of, you can take any of the stuff, including gene therapy, CRISPR, or AI, involves many sectors, and frequently when the product's in the market, we're trying to chase about how do you address this issue, how do you address that? So the idea is that we should bring the sectors together. Now that's not easy, but what Deborah and the team has done and the committee is to create a tool that can look at risk versus benefit. So that if you had a new technology, you could certainly look at it and say, aha, this is great, and these are areas we need to bring people together. So we want to come back to this, say, how do you use this going forward? And then in Keith's study, the committee is very clear to say that's a tool, but you can't change things unless people really believe in the practice of equity in everything they do. That's why I'm bringing all of you guys together. At the end, we're going to talk about how we can bring these really thoughtful approaches together, recognizing it's a complex issue, no doubt, but we need to start somewhere. I'm very excited about what's been done. So they both now open for any kind of questions you may have for either one of them. Lots of hands up. Take from your side first.
Sure. Sam Posner, CDC. In the sectors, I was wondering where you saw public health because it was very clinically oriented. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about in all of this is that public voice is so not a monolith. And how do we manage that in this discussion and this assessment?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I in the interest of time, I didn't obviously talk about the complexity of defining sectors, right? We had government, but that's of course civilian and military. And there are a million different ways that you could break out the sectors. We had to select one to enable us to at least begin to think about how technologies are playing out in these different sectors in ways that stress the governance ecosystem in different ways, right? So, I mean, I think public health probably spans a number of those sectors, and so can't be put any one place. With regard to public engagement, 100% agree. And I would actually love Alondra to be up here to talk about all of the engagement that they did, OSTP did, around the Framework for an AI Bill of Rights. I mean, I think that's a start. But we have all of these amazing technologies that could be deployed to help us do some of that engagement and gather feedback and information about a broad range of folks' interests, needs, fears, hopes for these technologies. They just need to be deployed in that way. But we've been saying, I completely agree that we've been saying for a long time. I often say that it used to be the last recommendation in every document was more research is needed. Now it's public engagement is required. And
yes, totally agree. And now what?
I just wanted to add one thing there, which is that I think the outcome of this study is to get us, after a long period of intensive research, to a starting point. And the question you ask is actually, for me, the starting point, which is to say that public engagement, or the public, has often been defined as in a kind of utilitarian way, as in the public is relevant insofar as I have a product to sell, or the public is relevant insofar as I have to clear certain kinds of ethics considerations, or the public is relevant insofar as I have to marshal research subjects. This is a challenge to ask different kinds of questions about the public, and in fact, the public isn't a sector. It's public engagement means asking questions about equity and benefit that are actually currently somewhat foreign to the innovation system. So I guess that's how I would answer the question, which is the question actually is the starting point. But incentivizing and compelling innovators to ask the question, and then have a system for sort of having a common definitions about public welfare or general welfare. I think this is, to me, the starting point.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. My name is Tracy Wong. I'm the Chief CER Officer at PCORI. PCORI funds a lot of clinical research that tries to bring together some of the more traditional sectors like academia and healthcare with some of the less traditional sectors like community stakeholders and partnerships. And interestingly, we are not hearing a lot of pushback on the equity piece from the latter. We're actually hearing a lot of pushback on the equity piece from what I would personally consider sort of the bastions of equity, the academia and health and health organizations. For these organizations, equity's almost become a dirty word. So we've got chief health equity officers becoming chief health officers. We are also hearing the pullback of equity surveillance research and initiatives, even in a health delivery organizations. The typical sort of monitoring for looking for disparities in health equity has been really substantively compromised. And then there are some of the sort of softer, more perhaps insidious influences like the inability to support academic faculty or clinicians in being able to meaningfully conduct activities that advance equity. And so as it relates to the heat map that you're presenting, I wonder if these two areas that we would expect to see progressing really well are in fact going to be substantively lagging, and that gap will worsen over the next decade because of some of these pressures, particularly in public entities like state universities and health systems. So just wondering if that sort of figured into how you're thinking about these initiatives and the deployment of those recommendations, Keith, you mentioned, as well as sort of from a heat mapping standpoint, does that sort of guide actions moving forward?
So we are in a very different place in this country than we were when we started this work, for a whole variety of reasons, right? The pandemic, Black Lives Matter, and now the backlash to all of the real purported commitments to that work that were made in the aftermath of the uprisings in 2020 and beyond. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I think that the heat map could be useful to highlight for those entities how they're doing relative to other sectors. That might be instructive. But it's a deep problem, and I don't have a pithy response, I'm afraid.
So I guess my not so pithy response would be that there are, I think you're identifying a really important question about how the word equity is itself become a flashpoint for political debate, such that everything that falls under the category equity is deemed to be problematic, disreputable, and in fact misguided, right? And so those who have developed, programs under the rubric of equity are rethinking the use of the term, But they're, at the same time that they are jettisoning the term, they're not relinquishing the underlying commitments. So here's what I would say is, you could get distracted by the term, but what are the underlying commitments? Well, there are things like, innovative technology shouldn't be so highly priced that they're out of reach of people. Most people would agree with that. That we should be committed to something like, equal or close to equal or fair access. That is to say, wealthy people shouldn't be the primary beneficiaries of an innovation system. I think most people would buy into that as a commitment. That's an equity commitment. You just left out the word equity. So issues of fairness, I think you have broad buy-in to that as a principle. So I guess the trick is, how do you move ahead by not allowing the politics of equity as a term to create a roadblock to what is in fact a fundamental commitment? So for instance, when the Screen Actors Guild asked a question about whether AI would lead to the loss of jobs, and they aggressively create new contracts to mitigate against those risks, that's about equity, right? They don't use the language of equity. So that's my view, which is that you're raising an important issue that's part of the political environment that we're in, but we can get distracted by the term. I'll give you just one other example. At the School of Public and International Affairs, we trained people to go into public policy and public service. And we had an initiative like a year and a half ago that was called like the diversity, courses on diversity. And well before these controversies, I said, really we should think about this as, policymaking in diverse societies. And it turns out that whereas people had a problem with diversity courses, nobody has a problem with diverse policymaking in diverse societies, interestingly enough. So a change of language and terminology can go a long way towards skirting some of what you're describing. I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying it's going to work everywhere, but to me that's the strategy moving forward. I hope that helps.
If I may, wait, sorry. Go
Can I
ahead.
just add one thing? Well, first, to thank Keith for reframing that in a way that pulled me out of my pit of despair. But also, I think it's worth pointing out that academic medical centers and the rest of us working in healthcare also live in a system that doesn't have a right to healthcare, right? So we are, from the get-go, at a disadvantage there, and having to sort of make up for existing inequities in the system as well.
Yeah, if I can just say a word. First of all, I think the heat map is a risk versus benefit issue. Right? You can call it whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you're looking at what are the risks, what are the benefits, how do we make decisions? So rather than being drawn into a word, in fact, that's exactly what it is. And if you listen carefully to Deborah's presentation, she had these 5 principles of fairness and others. These are being acted upon. They're not per se exactly what he said, right? Equity, but rather that these are the principles we all live with, and most people would agree with every one of these principles. So really what we're talking about is we just kind of think about the terminology, right, whereby we're talking about the principles and not the word where people interpret that word as advantage to some people, not to others, which everybody agrees that's not the right thing anyway, right? So I think we're going to work harder and think about how to communicate with this. But I don't think that anything that you're concerned, that we're all concerned about, should deter the idea of using a heat map to say, if you got a technology, let's look at what it means and what it means to principle. And then Keith's point is, it's really the issue of what we try and do every day that everybody will agree with, right? So I think there's a communication issue. Take a couple more questions, and we should move on. Yes, the lady in the back, white.
Hi, I'm Chen-Ying Hu from IBM Research. And thank you, Deborah and Keith, for a great summary of work from both communities.
Can you speak to the microphone?
Committees. And I agree with Deborah that both committees had a lot of foresight And a lot of the findings and recommendations there apply to the new technologies that emerged as we were talking about, managing emerging technologies. But at the same time, some of that, particularly AI, I think triggers a lot of thought and identifies some areas that requires new thinking and new thought. So I would like to rate some of this, some inspired by, the talk from Dr. Foster and some by Alondra. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So a few of those. One is Dr. Foster talked about one of the biggest disparity is disparity in access to information, and that AI could come in to help there. But the other side of the story is disinformation, where AI fallen into wrong hands could also enhance, right? So the question is, how do we address that, combat disinformation while providing more information? In a recent really great book that came out called Constitution of Knowledge by Jonathan Rauch, he talked about this notion of, truth being centered around accepted norms of how to vet knowledge. And in the tech community, when we talk about responsible AI, we talk a lot about provenance of data and models. And so the question is how much of that applies to this context, and what are your thoughts on that? Second is Dr. Foster also talked about CRISPR and bone marrows will never make it to the third world, and so we should instead invest more in small molecules. So the thought there is, okay, that doesn't necessarily mean we can or should discourage pharma companies from investing in biologics, because after all, those are some of the most promising directions when it comes to therapeutics. But perhaps what we could think about is, besides investing in small molecules, which, by the way, pharma companies don't need any incentive, they are continuing to invest in it anyway. But perhaps we need to think about how to encourage, in this community, this governance framework, how to encourage investments in scalable manufacturing of biologics so that these new therapies do become more affordable. And this is definitely an area pharma companies on their own are not investing sufficiently in. So that's another area of thought. And then the third one is Alondra talked about this now very famous chart of R&D investment and industry versus public sector. And so that brings about what it means, new implications on private-public partnership. And Deborah talked about incentives, which clearly is very important, because now the question is not just about where government needs to step in, where there's a gap in investment from the private industry, but also how we can incent that large chunk of the pie to go to the right direction. Another thought there is philanthropic investment. I'm not sure where that falls in that chart, but that's another chunk of really large investment that we could influence, and the question is how. And finally, sort of an implication on this committee, even looking at the level of investment, from industry versus the public sector, it seems to me that points to, in a discussion like this, in committees like this, we need to involve more, encourage more involvement from the private industry in this kind of discussions. And last one, Alondra talked about this notion of alignment with societal interests and how it connects to on the technology side, this notion of reinforcement learning with human feedback. Now, as we think more and more about applying these technologies to scientific discovery, we have been, in the tech world, have been working on this notion of extending that to reinforcement learning with lab feedback. So there now, one could argue there, the data is always hard, the lab data is lab data, so it's less obvious what it means in that context to be aligned with societal interests. When you talk about reinforcement learning from lab data, there is clearly, but it's much more subtle. And so then I think it requires more thought from this body in terms of how do you talk about incentives and guidance along the lines of aligning with societal interests when you are more talking about scientific discovery and data coming from labs. Thank you.
Well, that's a lot. Yeah. So I guess I just wanted to maybe very quickly, because I think we're pretty much out of time, go back to Representative Foster's comment, which I mentioned, which I found really provocative. So I'm a historian, and we're taught not to engage in counterfactuals, like, what different path might we have traveled. But when he said, what can be accomplished in a small budget scenario, or the molecular approach to thinking of, it made me think, well, okay, what would it have looked like if you had incentives for funding early on that actually prioritized affordable approaches to innovation in something like sickle cell disease, right? Like you prioritize, or you think with forethought about questions of access. Where might that have led? Maybe that's, like I said, the reason why historians don't use counterfactuals is because they're just not really useful to actually think with. But in some ways, it is a good question to ask, because that is in some ways the system that we are looking forward to trying to design. One that is proactive in prioritizing these kinds of questions. So that's just one quick response to your, I think it was 6 questions, right?
Yeah. Well, because of time, we have to move on. But these questions will come up again and again and again. So don't be impatient, because the rest of the day, in fact, we are taking these issues in the deeper dive by some case studies, bring people back together to discuss this. So thank you very much for both of you. Great talk.